advanced study among many, many other global honors. She's probably best known internationally for her role on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa and for her very widely acclaimed book, A Human Being Died That Night, A South African Story of Forgiveness, which I've used for many years in my own coursework as a teacher. Her book won the Christopher Award in the United States and the Alan Paton Award in South Africa in 2004. She's published many other works on themes of trauma, healing, memory, narrative, and forgiveness. There are two threads in her current research: the impact of dehumanizing oppression on next generations, or the aftermath of trauma, and also on forgiveness, including the role of empathy in an African knowledge context. We're so fortunate to have you here, Dr. Gobodo-Madikizela, as part of the Ubuntu Dialogues Partnership Project and as part of the African Studies Center at Michigan State University. You're warmly welcome.
Thank you very much, Jamie, and thank you to you, Penny, for organizing this event. I feel very welcome here, and it's wonderful to see. I suspect some of you are South African here. I see, or I've told, at least I think I'm seeing some South Africans. So it's wonderful to feel at home and to have people from home as well. This paper is a work in progress. I would like to test some insights that have emerged from my research on trauma and its intergenerational repercussions. This work began as a research on how young South Africans born after the end of apartheid understood or experienced reconciliation, and whether the notion of social transformation had any meaning for them. We soon found out that this was the wrong question to ask, or rather that we needed to ask new questions about what is going on in South Africa with the younger generation, with the younger post-apartheid generation that has come of age now. Transgenerational trauma is a trope that is used globally in countries with a history of mass trauma and violence. We were interested in this issue, but we also wanted to let the stories that we encountered to guide us to questions that would open up new terrains of investigation. This led to research that now pursues two strands of investigation: a search for what trauma and its repercussions mean in the South African context, on the one hand. On the other, what insights we might learn on how individuals and communities transcend these traumatic histories and how they reclaim a sense of agency after trauma, what might be referred to as healing after trauma. My paper is therefore exploratory, and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the TRC, has been an important site for my work. Interviews with victims and the study of their testimonies on the public stage of the TRC, as well as the study of their encounters with perpetrators outside the TRC, has revealed how the body becomes a profound form of language, expressed in very subtle ways, to convey a complex matrix of interacting psychological, cultural, political, and other factors that may not be nameable in these encounters in the aftermath of gross human rights violations. Much attention is paid to verbal language as a vehicle for narrative representation, yet body language and other forms of symbolic expression can also be ways of communicating different traumatic experiences. The body explodes and breaks open a different kind of voice, precisely because of the symbolism it carries, a voice that speaks to the desire for recognition of pain and suffering endured over many generations into the present. This voice issues out in the tradition of a call and response, speaking and being heard, reminding us that The call to repair the past should be renewed every day with each generation that inherits a past not lived. And so, in responding to the invitation to address you this afternoon, I draw from the tradition of storytelling to share with you unique historical moments that have been illuminating. These stories are less from the great philosophers and religious and political theorists than from ordinary people who themselves have suffered irreparably. I begin, therefore, with a story from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of South Africa, that shining moment in our history whose enduring lessons about what is possible in the aftermath of tragedy still shine a bright light in my memory, having served as chair of the TRC's Human Rights Violations Committee in the Western Cape. I want to begin by inviting you to listen to a minute-long audio clip. The clip is the iconic scream of Nomonde Kalata, who testified at the opening of the TRC public hearings about the killing of her husband, Fort Kalata, by the apartheid security police. He was stabbed in the heart 4 times, as the post-mortem revealed. His body burnt by the apartheid security police in an effort to conceal the hand of the state in the crime that they committed. The audio clip ends, or rather begins again, with a response by a white South African music composer who transforms Nomonde Kalata's scream into music. The performance of this music is itself a call to empathy for the suffering of the other, but it also invites us to pose new questions about these trauma testimonies, to ask what else they might be telling us about the complicated legacies of oppressive colonial past. At the opening of the public hearings of the TRC, the large city hall in the South African city of East London was capacity full, all black, with the white TRC commissioners and some reporters, the only visible white people in the audience. When the audience rose to sing a song that was at once a poem and an anthem of black pain, sung throughout the years of apartheid by black people at mass funerals, political rallies, and peaceful protests, the song Liza Lisidinga Lakho Nkosi, Fulfill Your Will and Promise, Lord, reverberated into the large hall, carrying the hope that the moment promised. This was the same moment into which the widow of 4th Kalata Nomonde screamed her pain, daring to give voice to it, for it to be heard beyond the walls of the public hearings. Imagine that, a piercing scream that seemed to shatter the magnificent walls of the East London Hall, a structure built in colonial times to celebrate Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee. The building still housed memorial plaques for some of the fallen British soldiers when the British and the Afrikaners fought to take over South Africa. Reflecting on this scene at the time, surrounded by the walls that harken back to an earlier generational time, it seemed to me that this wailing cry might be captured and interpreted in one's imagination as a moment that represents at once an expression of anger and pain. With the violent movement of Mrs. Kalata's body thrown back as she let out a scream, it signified a crying out to a past that goes back several generations. As she screamed, she was almost like rocking her body back and forth like this. And her body seemed to carry the haunting weight of this past, seemingly expunging it into the TRC's public space of communal remembering. Using her voice and body in this way reclaimed her sense of agency to confront this violent history and to expose those responsible for her irreparable loss. Objectified in so many ways as a racial and sexual other in order to legitimate the colonial apartheid order, her testimony shifted the gaze from the object of oppression to shine the light on the depravity of the perpetrators. South African musician Philip Miller then resurrects this wailing voice from the archives of the TRC narratives, producing the music cry that we heard earlier. The iconic voice of South African soloist Sibongile Khumalo then picks up Mrs. Kalata's crying voice and represents it through her magnificent, electrifying mezzo-soprano. Later in the song, several other voices emerge and merge into a choir, producing a chorus of collective voices intermingled with the voices of other victims and survivors. And sometimes the victims and voices, the victims and survivors' voices are dominated by perpetrators' voices, of their voices of denials, their voices of their confessions, the voices of the perpetrators' commanders as well. The effect that Philip Miller's music is a seamless repetition that reverberates like a reenactment of a wound in this large hall that refuses to be silenced, almost like a reverberation, not just through the enclosure of the hall, but also as music played long after the TRC, a reverberation that continues throughout space and time. Mrs. Kalata's reverberating music cry seems to be telling the audience, this is not yet past. History playing itself out, talking back to the past, and at the same time, telescoping into the future. The TRC served a narrative function that went beyond individual witnesses' testimonies. Individual narratives and experiences recounted at the TRC carried an extra weight because they went beyond the individual to capture a larger story of collective trauma. The testimonies were an important source of history and of historical reflection on the significance of traumatic past for memory, its reconstruction, as victims and survivors try to make sense of their traumas and to reclaim their sense of agency. I want to suggest here that we begin to look at these testimonies not only as evidence of the frozen in time perspective, but perhaps as a foretelling of a future as yet to come. the collective mournful cry of witnesses at the TRC, the victims' quest for truth in the face of lies and half-truths, pointed us to the unfinished business of this past. Unfinished because the unmourned remains of loved ones still hidden in the secret graves of apartheid South Africa's covert operations death farms are still undiscovered, are still unacknowledged. Could it be that then the brutality on women's bodies in South Africa today is the future foretold at the TRC by the memorable, mournful testimonies that suggested not closure, but rather a question? What have we done? Might the savagery on women's bodies in South Africa today, the raping, murder, and dismembering of women's bodies that has dominated our news, a foretelling that we failed to see at the time of the TRC public hearing? As if this idea of the question was on Archbishop Tutu's mind. As the silence hovered over and covered the hall, later when the hearings of the TRC resumed, the resonance of Mrs. Talata's piercing cry still reverberating in the collective memory of the audience, Archbishop Tutu sang the question that has been sung by Black people throughout the decades of apartheid oppression. Senzenina, what have we done? We should have known then, because this was a reminder of the strong intergenerational connection between Archbishop Tutu's own relentless struggle against violence and the stories of pain recounted by Mrs. Talata and other TRC witnesses. Archbishop Tutu's singing of the song was itself a wailing cry of Black pain, its resonance a force that could have woken us up to another truth, that the wordlessness of a scream and the mournful sound of a song symbolize an abiding framework, not only of a shared memory of the past, but also of a future past, a presencing of the future at the moment of testimony, presenting us with the possibility of looking at trauma not as a repetition of the past, but its continuity. Something that is repeated, that is reenacted, suggests a return or a return after a break, say the break between generations. But what is conveyed by this notion of continuity is an enduring trauma that continues ceaselessly. There is no break. There is no post. Now, at the beginning of my talk today, earlier on, I mentioned the importance of the notion of intergenerational cycles of repetition, intergenerational cycles of trauma, as part of what we're interested in understanding what is happening to the young South Africans today. Perhaps a story that might illustrate and fit in with the trauma theory, our understanding of what repetition of the trauma is. What happens when the next generation reenacts trauma is the story of Joyce Mtimkulu. Joyce Mtimkulu's son, Siphiwe Mtimkulu, was murdered by the apartheid security police. He was an activist. He was really not even a combatant. He was not, never used any force. He was a young student protesting against the celebration of Republic Day during the apartheid years. And so the protest was really to ask the Black people to stay at home and not to celebrate Republic Day because it's so associated with apartheid. He never carried any arms, but he was arrested as a member of the young activist anti-apartheid movement of the ANC, detained without trial, tortured severely, and poisoned. When he was released back to go home, it turned out that the poison that he had been given was starting to eat him up. And so one of the most obvious signs that this was thallium poisoning was the loss of his hair. So when he was hospitalized, doctors found out that he had been poisoned in detention by the security police. This was denied by the man who was in charge of the torture and who himself conducted the torture. Fortunately, as these things happen, the story was told by Siphiwe himself. There's a moving recording of his voice. He had by now lost the muscles of his throat, and so he was speaking with difficulty. The effect of the poison very clear in the way that he was speaking, not just in the loss of the hair, but also in the way that he was delivering his voice. He was describing how he was tortured by Gideon Nivot, one of the most feared perpetrators, security force police in the Eastern Cape. Now, Joyce Mtimkulu didn't know what happened to her son until this was revealed in hospital. Now, unfortunately, the moment he was released from hospital, he was captured again by the police because he had started to sue the police for the torture. And he had begun also to sue he was going to sue the police not just for torture, but also for poisoning. So they captured him and he disappeared. His body was never found by the parents. And so the quest of Mrs. Mtimkulu, as he came to the commission, you can see she's holding something on her right hand. Now, that is his hair. And as she testified at the TRC, she says, this is not hair that I just cut out from someone at home. This is my son's hair. You can see, and it shows us the flesh on because the way the violence with which the hair falls is that it falls with the skin attached to the hair as well. And she keeps this hair from 1983 until she testified as the TRC in 1997. Now, mind you, she was prevented, or the perpetrators tried to prevent her from testifying, not once but 3 times. They were silencing her, not wanting the truth to come out. And even when eventually she came to the TRC, they continued to tell lies, because while she wanted to know what happened to her son, she wanted to have her son's body back so that she could bury her son and at least begin a proper, journey of mourning. The perpetrators lied, and they said they threw the ashes in the river, in Fish River. Now, because, as you might imagine, when you are in this desperate situation, you are also desperate to believe whatever lies, whatever is told, you are told, to hold on to some sort of vestige of perhaps just the possibility of truth in the lies. And so Mrs. Mtimkulu, with her husband and family, they take a journey to Fish River, to where they said they buried the ashes of the son, and they have a ceremony on the banks of the Fish River. They bring flowers, and there's a whole, ceremony that the family performs as last rites for his son, to bid him goodbye and to reconnect his spirit with their lives. And all the time thinking that there just might be true that he was indeed thrown in the ashes. Yet years later, as Mrs. Mtimkulu continued to search for the truth about her son's remains, she travels to the farm where he was tortured, one of these apartheid government secret farms, where the son was tortured with her husband, and Mark Kaplan was making a film about their story. And here is the fascinating thing about this moment, this visit, the family's visit, and especially also in view of what I'm trying to convey. I'm trying to read into these stories, this idea that there's something that they are telling us beyond the story of trauma. So Mrs. Mtimkulu is standing outside this house, and in this space where presumably the son was burnt, they are thinking, considering what might have happened, and obviously in memory, going back in memory, trying to imagine what happened to the son. And she points, she says, I really don't believe these people that, what if my son is still here? What if my son is buried somewhere here? And she's gesturing and pointing and pointing repeatedly towards a cistern that is stuck behind a door on the outside. She is pointing and pointing at this and saying, maybe my son is buried somewhere here. He must be somewhere here. I don't believe this man. And it turns out, down the line, with the investigators of the people in charge of exhumations, it turns out that the bodies of the son and his comrades, the remains, were actually hidden in the cistern, the very cistern that she was pointing to as she was gesturing, saying, my son is somewhere here. I mean, how incredible is that when now we look back and we look at all these happenings and think about what might that have meant at the time. But we would not know until after the fact, right? Until we are retracing now, back, we're moving from the future back into the past to think about what the gesture may have meant at the time, but which we did not understand. But I think that there is something about these testimonies that our rereading of them might point to something that we might have missed at the time, to some other truths that lie waiting for us to rediscover them. And so this is what I'm working with in this work. I'm trying to reread these testimonies along these lines, and I'd appreciate your comments afterwards, and you're helping me to think through about it. And part of this is really, my thinking about this is that what's happening in South Africa today is so complicated, it's so difficult to understand the kind of violence that we're witnessing in my country, especially these past few months, the violence on women's bodies. When you think about it, you have to think and think, what is it that it means? What is it that you kill a person and then you don't just kill him, or you don't just kill her, you kill a woman, sometimes it is men, of course, and you don't just kill them and they die, you kill them again, because when you kill a person and they die, and then you cut them up, you slit their throats, or you cut their body parts into pieces and stash them in a black bag. There's something about that we are challenged to understand what it is about. It's almost like, it's not enough to just murder the person. There's something about the violation after the body is dead. So then it seems to me that it's not just about killing the person, it's about something else. And the question is, what is that something else? And so I'm wondering whether psychology, sociology, history, and all these disciplines have something to tell us about what's going on. And it seems to me that they don't, that they cannot adequately give us the language to understand what is going on. And we have to turn to literature because in a way, these kinds of things, it seems like they're metaphors for something else that's going on. It seems like these are stories of fiction. And so we ought then to get to that level of understanding them. And this is not unusual, because the story of trauma itself, the whole field of trauma, has drawn very strongly from literature. Kathy Caruth's work and even Sigmund Freud himself has drawn from images of theater to deepen our understanding about some of the concept of trauma. The story, for instance, that Kathy Caruth uses a lot to show what we mean by the idea of a trauma that returns to haunt, a trauma that is expressed only belatedly. In other words, it is not known until much later. This is the language of trauma, understanding trauma. That trauma appears belatedly. It is not understood at the time that it is happening. And some of the stories that I use are drawn from Greek theater. The play, for instance, Jerusalem liberated is about the re-wounding of a lover by Tancred, who is used as an indication, as an illustration of how trauma returns again to haunt the person who encountered this trauma. So I think it is possible here too that these stories that we have witnessed at the TRC are not just archival material, but rather are productively used by us to produce new knowledge, new understandings of the field of trauma, particularly in this era of decolonizing, or of the need of conversations about decolonizing knowledge. It seems to me that here is an archive that is waiting for us to rethink the tropes that we use in understanding trauma and focus on what we are learning from our own context as tropes that we can use to produce new knowledge about understanding trauma. Now, we understand, again, staying with psychoanalysis, we understand, especially that one of the people who have brought this very strongly to our understanding is Frantz Fanon, that when people have been violated repeatedly, it is inevitable that the violence plays itself out again. Now, what the scholars like him don't really tell us is what exactly, why is it that sometimes the violence is so unspeakable, is so beyond our imagination, that these scholars don't really get to tell us what it is that leads people to these extreme, unspeakable forms of violence. Is it something that is repeated from the past, from the colonial past, from even pre-colonial past, violence that was never dealt with? Is it passed on? Is this idea of trauma passed on in the way that trauma says it is passed on a useful way of understanding what is going on here? And my sense is that it is not adequate, that we need other ways of understanding what is going on. Now, while Frantz Fanon suggests that it is inevitable, if people are engaged in violence, have experienced violence, we will experience violence by the same victims becoming perpetrators. While he says that, at the same time, he says something else as well. He says we must pay attention to that possibility so that we try to break those cycles and build connections between us. The public hearing that demonstrates this idea of victims it's subtle, victims turning into perpetrators, is one that, by the way, I just want to finish this story that Mrs. Mtimkulu's story does not, I wanted to also add another piece that speaks to the idea of repetition of trauma. The torturer of the son of Spiwe Mtimkulu, although he denied knowledge of poisoning the son, he nonetheless went to the family to ask for their forgiveness. This young man, he was 14 at the time. Is it possible to dim a little bit the backlights? Because I think it's important that we see the face of this young man. Yes, that's better. Thank you very much. He was 14 years at the time, and he had attended the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And when the perpetrators described what they did to the father, at the moment when they were talking about putting his body on the pyre and setting it alight, he collapsed at the TRC. And he had to be carried outside the TRC. Now, he's sitting at home. This man comes to apologize to the parents, and he's somewhere in the background because he didn't testify himself, was in the audience. He's sitting, even when he visits the home, this man visits the home, it's the grandparents talking to him. And he's somewhere there in the shadows. And there's a moment where I think this thing is really working on him. Seeing this man and all the fury and the anger of what he had done. He was 3 months when his father died. He does not know his father. So he throws a vase at this man, and it smashes his skull. And here is another important moment that I will come back to later in my paper. The grandparents rushed to help this man because now he's bleeding. They don't say, serves you right, you're a perpetrator. They rush to help him. Now this again, and this is without thinking. It's the kind of instinctive human moment that when someone is hurt, you rush to assist. And this is for me, this is a demonstration of that real depth of human core that exists, and this is what I want to call Ubuntu, which is not necessarily only African. It's a human capacity for us to respond in this way. Now, there is another illustration of what happens, this intergenerational trauma when victims are venturing into that gray zone of becoming aggressors themselves. This story of Jeffrey Benzine at the public hearing of this man who was the most feared, also similar to the torturer of Sipho Mtimkulu, but in the Western Cape, also feared, also known, infamous for the torture methods he used. Now, he was asked by the one of his victims, Tony Yengeni, to demonstrate the torture methods that he used on them. Now, many people were uncomfortable about this. Made many people uncomfortable. What I think it brings brings up many questions. For me, the important two issues that it brings up for me. One is that these moments really show up these perpetrators for the depravity, the human depravity of these men. Now you can see this is what they did. At the same time, it opens our eyes to the possibility of this slippage between victim and perpetrator, victim, this swinging, pendulum between one being a victim and one becoming an aggressor. And that is what it reveals to me. And then, of course, because we're dealing with the Truth Commission, these are questions that we ought to have attended to have seen that this too is possible. That this means that the aggressor, the potential for the aggressor in the victim themselves is always a potential, is always there. And this is something that we ought to pay attention to. Now the importance, again, just to stay with the importance of showing the depravity of this man. I want that how dehumanized they are themselves, because remember, before a perpetrator dehumanizes a victim, they've got to dehumanize the self. And that is the tragedy of these kinds of acts. And so to show them up, to mirror back the dehumanization to them is also important. And I think that an illustration that captures very powerfully this idea of focusing our attention not so much on the victim, but rather on the perpetrator, to show up there, to get them to show their depravity and their dehumanity, is captured most powerfully by this image. Now, you may have seen this, some of you may have seen this, it's actually on the internet. There are bodies, these people are celebrating the lynchings of black men, of young black men. The bodies have been removed from the screen, and now you just see the people who are in smiles and are celebrating the lynching of the bodies. That the idea, again, this shifts the focus from the object of oppression to shine the light on the depravity of perpetrators. It's a powerful stance that unsettles the vision that associates goodness with all things white and savagery with black people in South Africa. And this is, again, this illustration is this is an artwork by Ken Gonzalez Day here in the United States. And the series, he does a series of all pictures, images of lynchings, but he removes the bodies so that you can focus on attention on the doer of the deed. The series invites the viewer to cast the gaze not on the victims of the lynching, but rather on the spectators of this crime. His series is called Erased Lynchings. This forces us to reflect on the extreme depravity of these spectators and to ponder about the conditions of a society that perpetuates such acts of dehumanization. Now, some people might say, why remove the bodies? You have to show the bodies. Removing them is a denial. But I think far from denial of history, inviting the imaginary of these sites of crime presents us with potent evidence and confronts us with the question, who are these people responsible for dehumanization of fellow human beings? And where are they now? What stories do they tell their children about this shameful history? How are the memories of this shame passed down? Through reflective engagement with it or through silencing and denial? These are some of the most urgent questions of our time. Few topics stake a more compelling claim on humanities research than the legacies of historical trauma: apartheid, colonialism, slavery, and other watershed moments of crime against humanity in the 20th and 21st centuries are not events of the past. These are not events in the past. They are a history whose traumatic repercussions reverberates across multiple generations. Therefore, this history has to be faced in order to be transcended. James Baldwin reminds us, however, that not everything that is faced can be changed, but, quote, nothing can be changed until it is faced, unquote. Now, again, back to Frantz Fanon, he speaks about the importance of healing, the importance, although violence is a reaction to deep pain, and this is an inevitable consequence of these oppressive and destructive, human destructive experiences, there is a need at the same time for us to be aware of these consequences, but rather to undo these stories by trying to connect with one another, victims, perpetrators, bystanders. And he says the following, quote, both oppressed and oppressor must turn their backs on the inhuman voices, which were those of their respective ancestors, in order that authentic communication be possible. Before it can adopt a positive voice, freedom requires an effort at disalienation. The simple attempt to touch the other, to feel the other, to explain the other to myself, unquote. When I served on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, I designed the TRC's outreach program, which defined, explained to the public, to potential witnesses, how the commission was going to work. I also was involved for facilitating dialogues about reconciliation. We believed in this process. We believed that the TRC was bringing about a change, and we could see the transformation within the TRC itself, between people who were witnesses at the TRC and also in audiences. People who came, you could see in their body language that they kind of didn't trust the process, but you could see as the days of the week of the hearings went on that people were embracing the process. You know, white people who came thinking that, oh, this is about, you know, witch hunting and chasing white people or paying back at white people. Some of them, and many of them who came to the TRC, you could see that the process actually led them into some kind of introspection, and they were moved into engaging with the process in ways that were very unique, that for us pointed to the possibility of transformation within these processes. So we were very hopeful. So I ran these public dialogue processes as a way of keeping the dialogue, the public dialogue about reconciliation, going on in parallel with the public hearings, where we were hearing about these terrible, horrible things that had happened to people. So we felt that we had to have a dialogue about the importance of reconciliation, what it meant, while at the same time people were hearing these stories. So kind of a balance in the public discourse. Engaging in dialogue about the past is a multifaceted terrain. in considering the process of dialogue about historical past. What is perhaps necessary now as I reflect on what has happened in the past few years in the country? I have now reflected on the significance of that moment, but also on what is missing in the dialogue about reconciliation. And so I'm at a place where I realize that what is important and necessary is shifting the lens, to shift the lens from a focus on forgiveness and reconciliation, concepts that imply a goal. This is what we want to achieve. We are coming together so that we can have reconciliation, and we're coming together so that there can be forgiveness. To shift from this kind of focus to experience, complicated, enigmatic, muddy, elusive, and unpredictable. The reason for this is that much of what happens in these encounters, in these experiences, when you bring people from different sides of history, remains implicit. And the word forgiveness falls short of adequately capturing the complexity of what happens when people are brought together. I've suggested that empathic repair captures more effectively the complexity of this dialogue process. The significance of the notion of the reparative lies in the fact that the work of healing after historical trauma must necessarily be an ongoing process. Reparative suggests movement and engagement in a constant search for the emergence of human moments that can create a sense of solidarity and transcend old dividing lines that promote othering. The quest for reparative humanism gestures towards transformative moments and new relational experiences. The goal is to recognize the humanity of victims and perpetrators and bystanders alike for the sake of a transformed conception of society in order to help heal historical ruptures. The story of South Africa is one that is haunted by questions. What dreams were shattered, deferred, because of opportunities lost under a system of discriminatory laws meant to exclude and degrade individuals and communities declared inferior by apartheid, a system so vicious that the international community called it a crime against humanity. At the same time, however, what dreams had been squandered by the rampant corruption that reached unimaginable heights during the Jacob Zuma years. Nelson Mandela had set the tone with his own example of how he dealt with his enemies. He had infused public discourse at the time of transition from apartheid with the language of reconciliation and a vision that many South Africans interpreted as a language of forgiveness. We realize now that, in fact, that language was very inadequate. There was much more that was needed to be done. I think that young people today, their rejection of the Mandela legacy is misguided. What is important is for us to return to that vision, to really engage with that vision, including with the TRC, Truth and Reconciliation Commission, to understand what is it that you can learn about these moments of transition as a form, as a site for precisely doing what students want us to do, decolonizing knowledge. You know, changing, shifting, and changing the focus of knowledge makers so that they themselves are knowledge makers, not only by dissing this work, but rather going back to look into what is missing, what was missing, what went wrong, so that they are the knowledge makers that inform us in terms of what we can learn about these processes rather than to dismiss it and to throw it out as a process that was led by sellouts. Now, these processes, even though we are asking these new questions, what we found out at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is that this is possible. It is possible to build bridges. It is possible for people from different sides of history to connect, to come together, and to create new forms of relationships. And it seems to me that at the center of these processes of engagement that bring people together One way of understanding them is that potential for humans, the possibilities, the human possibilities that exist within every one of us, unless, of course, we're not talking about people who are psychopaths, of course, but we're talking about ordinary humanness, that when there is an opportunity to bring people together, something emerges from this space of conversation about the past unexpectedly, that it is possible because of who we are as human beings. And it seems to me that at the center of these possibilities is this concept of Ubuntu in action. When we say in my language, Umtu ngumtu, ngabanye abantu, which loosely translated, we are human because of the presence of other human beings. We imply an ethic based on the understanding that one's subjectivity is inextricably intertwined with that of others in one's community through reciprocal mutual recognition of the other's human dignity. In other words, a person is a person through being witnessed and engaging in reciprocal witnessing of other persons. Alternatively, human subjectivity is defined by the multiplicity of relationships with others. The meaning conveyed by these expressions is twofold. First, human subjectivity depends on being witnessed. The richness of subjectivity flows from interconnectedness with the wider community and from the reciprocal caring and complementarity of human relationships. Second, the phrase conveys the kind of reciprocity that calls on people to be ethical subjects. Mutual recognition inspired by Ubuntu is fundamental to being a fellow human being, a relational subject in the context of community. I've seen this playing in very unique ways in Rwanda. Unique because Rwanda is a site of an extreme violence that we all witnessed on our television screens in 1994. And yet, when one I know that Rwanda is complicated, but when one goes into these communities, you witness this idea of relationality, that people coming together to build their communities, victims and perpetrators alike. And there are stories that I had hoped to tell, to share with you, but time is not on our side. But I think suffice to say that these kinds of moments of recognition of the other and connecting with the other in an authentic way, in order to hold hands together and to say, we want to build our community, we want to build our society. We are moving from this past of violence, and we are driving a different kind of vision for our future together. That connecting with others and the recognition of the role of one another from whatever sides of history we come is not from the distance that bestows such recognition of the other from a position of power, but from one that does so from a place of proximity to the other's life world, understanding their history, their circumstances, why they are who they are, and all that is associated with their understanding their life world. It is an experience near, to appropriate a term from one psychologist, that opens up the possibility of an embodied recognition that seeks to repair the brokenness of the other, because now it is like one's own brokenness. This leads me to suggest that in the aftermath of historical trauma, restoring human bonds requires a new vocabulary of rehumanization. This new mode of being human, what I have referred to as reparative humanism, opens towards a horizon of an ethics of care for the sake of a transformed society. If the level of depravity that has been captured most compellingly with the phrase, the banality of evil, is fostered in an environment in which inhumanity against others thrives, then it should be possible that relationships that foster thoughtfulness and a sense of being human can reproduce themselves in our relational world. So this word empathic repair is very relevant in my work now. And it's a notion that points towards not only one's own healing, but also one's responsibility to participate in the building of a society in which people could come together and be fellow human beings. And as Frantz Fanon says, to touch another, to feel one another, sharing in the vision of a more humane society. These sites of coming together, of giving testimony about our past and hearing and listening to one another, these sites, they are sites of mutual recognition and shared experience. They provide points of identification, entryways into the experience of another, which enable comparison across critical registers of difference. In other words, whether you're black, white, Tutsi, Hutu, Israeli, Palestine, these moments enable the possibility of connecting across these registers of difference. I have seen and witnessed at the Truth Commission victims of apartheid approaching mothers whose sons were killed in the violence of apartheid, approaching mothers or a mother at the Truth Commission of a son who died in the South Africa's, in the apartheid government's war that it called the border war, which was not really the border, it was fighting the war in the countries, trying to prevent the freedoms of those countries. And their sons were killed. And I've witnessed mothers reaching out to one another, to these mothers, as mothers, having lost from these crimes of apartheid, and other mothers having lost their sons in a different way, with soldiers who were fighting for the freedom against the freedom of black people in South Africa, coming together and connecting. And it seems ironic that these moments, these factors, the factors that can ignite and perpetuate animosity, fear, and hatred, the love of one's child. You love your child so much that you hate the person who killed them. You love your loved one, so deeply that you can't bear the sight of the person who had harmed them. And yet, those same inclinations, that same love might also be suspended. The love might suspend those kinds of reactions, those negative sentiments, by providing a way into the experience of the enemy. The love and loss may provide a way out of violence. The love of my child, because this other person has lost their child, it provides a connection with the other woman. Because I've lost, she has lost. So it provides an entryway into the experience of the other. Ultimately, love and loss are what is common, and thus, in a sense, are what is shared. It seems clear that once people, even those who are adversaries, are faced with each other, innumerable possibilities, both destructive and restorative, and all that cannot be reduced to these oversimplified categories, arise, both within and between bodies. I think one can accept that those encountering each other will be affected, whether they will necessarily be affected in a way that will move them towards connecting or disconnecting. It really depends on what is it that we are setting up. The challenge is to begin rather than to withdraw and not to engage in that way. Because the potential for the unexpected, unforeseen, and thoroughly creative, endemic to the human condition, is always present. These are precisely the ideas that were embodied in the TRC, which was nothing less than an effort to imbue the realms of law, justice, and politics with a relational cultural ethics. and in this case, since we're talking about Ubuntu, a cultural ethics of Ubuntu, and indeed, this term is infused in all of the throughout the Constitution, our new Constitution after apartheid. This is recognized as a vision that will bring the humanity, us back to this point of humanity. This is what Steve Biko talked about when he says, we as Africans, we are going to teach our country, we are going to show our country what it is to be human. And he was really hearkening to this notion of what we understand about that potential, this possibility to connect with one another from whatever angle, size we come from, for the sake of the conception of a transformed society. I want to suggest here that we begin to look at these testimonies of the TRC, not only as evidence of this frozenness, but as a creative, as a possibility, as a productive space for us to rethink this past and to think about what is possible for us to do. And I think that as scholars, young and older scholars, the invitation stands, is out there for us to look at this, to revisit the archive so that we can find new ways of theorizing, of learning and theorizing anew about it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's a lot to absorb. I feel a bit speechless. But we have an opportunity for questions. Would you like to sit in a chair? We can, perhaps you can sit here. If you don't mind, just holding the microphone so that we can record and.
Yes, it's so wonderful to see you again. Mark Auslander, the director of the MSU Museum, and our entire museum staff is so grateful that you came to see our exhibition on gender-based violence that was situated here. So as you were speaking, I'm Mark Auslander again, yeah, just for the recording. I was thinking about coming out of my own research in rural Southern Africa on the relationship between poisoning in its indigenous sense and what that comes to mean under apartheid, and its particular relation to a sort of embodied culture of violent masculinity, of wounded masculinity, because there's a long history that I think you're signaling to. So classically, in rural Southern African communities, poisoning is often understood as a weapon of the weak, specifically under context in which women themselves have been subject to assault by men, by sexual assault by men, or other things that have sort of cut them out of the network of kinship, especially from returning minors. The one weapon open to them is poisoning, and the way that indigenous poisons are usually understood to work is by precisely emulating what has been done to them. That is to say, cutting the subject of poisoning, classically a man, out of the network of reciprocity that makes us normally human. It's almost an anti-Ubuntu technology. And because often the proof that someone has been poisoned is that in their final moments they don't even recognize, for example, their own mother. So what seems to have happened historically, one might argue, is that this logic of poisoning has been extended nationwide throughout the entire national body, so that the use, for example, of cadmium is both materially meaningful but also symbolically meaningful, because it's precisely the mass operation of these toxins that destroyed the health of millions of bodies in the mines and other industrial processes is now being applied in microcosm by Third Force and others to the bodies of the bodies of those in the liberation struggle, so that their bodies become in microcosm the national poisoned body. But how does the interesting question is that, and the enormously painful question is that, how does one relate this to the present moment, as you say, of horrific assault on the bodies of women, especially young women who should be generative, and that somehow the very embodied historical trauma that you're tracing And that sense of weakened or fractured, alienated masculinity now plays out specifically upon the bodies of young women. It's a very, something about the relationship between poisoning and a crisis of masculinity seems important here. And this leads me to ask, and this goes back again to my own experiences in Zambia in the 1980s, looking at local communities that had complex relations with MK partisans. And is the failure, for all the important things that were accomplished in the TRC, but is the failure historically to face up to a legacy of sexual violence within the liberation movement, is that one of the things that continues to plague the society? That until those crises, that absence, that which is not fully named, that the liberation, that the movement in many ways was fought upon the bodies of women in a way that could not be spoken of, is that still something that plagues the society?
That part, the last part, what you just said about the failure of, thank you for your comment, the failure of engagement with that is something that I'm very interested in. I have been wondering about myself. Now, you're talking about the liberation movement, a period removed, a little bit somewhat removed from the moment. Mm-hmm. I have wondered about, for instance, the violence that has exploded within campuses. During the Fees Must Fall and student movements, there were issues of, patriarchy were there, but they were silenced. In fact, some of these women talked about women themselves protecting some of these men. In fact, there was a term that was used, they called them patriarchy queens, because they protected these men. And I have been wondering whether part, at least in relation to the violence against women on campuses, whether part of the problem has to do with the silencing of exactly these problems at that time, that it was not spoken, and now it kind of gave it permission, for want of a better way of understanding it. In other words, it was perpetuated, it was not stopped at the time it was supposed to, it was perpetuated. Now, we've seen this also in the struggle, as you very clearly point out. Throughout these struggles, even in fact in the Black consciousness movement here in the US, there were always these debates that issues of patriarchy or violence by Black men should be put in the back burner because we're fighting racism, we're fighting oppression. And so this has tended to be, the way that we relate to these issues, because, there's a tendency to want to protect our men rather than to actually speak out about these issues. And so now we are confronted with these issues, and even talking about this in this way, it continues to be criticized because, people don't want to focus on that as a problem, and yet it is a problem that ought to be addressed. Now, on the other issue, the historical stuff, I agree with you that there's something about, I'm not very well versed with the medicine and the poisoning stuff, but what I can say, I can speak to, is the idea of the emasculation and the woundedness of the male body, and the sense of lack of agency, that the loss of agency by these men. Now, remembering that in a patriarchal society, there's manhood means something. Masculinity, there's a view of masculinity, meaning you're a provider, you are the stronger one, you are in control. And in fact, when some of these men, they go for initiation, to be initiated, to become men. They come from the bush as men, but actually their experience is far from it, because they come back, how can you be a man when you can't provide for your own, when you have no control of your life, when, you know, the woman has worked for herself, when all of the meanings that are associated with manhood are not true, are not realizable because of the circumstances that, you know, of inequality, you know, of history. But this is the reality that you are ending up being the hollowness of your masculinity, meaning nothing, and therefore a lashing out, as it always happens, that the lashing out is always against the weak. I mean, that playing out along with issues of, you know, just the association of sexual pleasure and power and the ability to do to the woman what a man feels they can do. So it's layers and layers, and all these situations, I mean, there isn't one way of understanding what's going on, but I think all these situations, these ways of thinking about what's going on, we should bring them to bear in order to think more carefully about what is going on. I'd be interested in the poisoning theme that you kind of laid out so clearly, and I think there's something there that I would be interested in pursuing.
Thank you for a very enlightening talk on a topic that I think is very, very important, particularly in the Southern African context, where conflict existed for such a long time. I think you pointed out to a very important moment when you gave the example of, you know, how effective or some of the results, the positive results that came out of the Truth and Reconciliation project, where mothers from different races and histories recognized the pain of the other and shared that pain and presumably got some healing out of that exercise. I thought that was a very interesting moment because apartheid, certainly the white mothers grew up being told and trained that they deserved the privilege that they had because they were white, and blacks were inferior in that they were less than human, basically. But when that happens, you know, when that sharing and when the recognition of that common fate happens, it's a transformative moment. In that it takes that type of project for the wrongs of apartheid to be corrected at an individual level. And I thought that was very, very significant. Perhaps one can problematize what I'm reading out of it to say how real or how enduring, how lasting would that realization become past the Truth and the Reconciliation process.
I think that's a very important. I mean, part of what people call the failure of the commission is really the failure to sustain those moments or to sustain those lessons so that we draw from them and create other opportunities for that to be sustained. Because so much else happens after the TRC and people lose their hearts to engage at that level. Exactly. And yet we saw that this is possible, right? So, and that should be really the moment that is important for us to build on.
Thank you for your talk. I arrived slightly a bit late, student obligations. As you were concluding your talk, I found it very interesting kind of talking about these ideas of building this collective body of narrative about where South Africa is coming from and where it's going. And you know, reflecting on like the Rainbow Nation rhetoric and this idea of born frees, right, that the Born Free label was attached to just one segment of the population. So there was never really a collective identity of South African youths transitioning into '94. And so that already it created psychological or maybe even a social divide of how Black South African young people identified themselves as these born free people, and therefore the expectations that come with being free, right? Whereas their probably white South African counterparts never had to even rationalize this notion of being born free. And so that, what are your thoughts around this idea of maybe even in thinking about the recent movements, the Fees Must Fall, and even the sexual assault movement, of these moments where these collective narratives were being created by these women or by these students within their spaces, and how these can be really harnessed to reconstitute what it means to be young in South Africa, what it means to be South African, because we would still see the iteration of the same issue manifested differently, of these unique identities created in the name of liberation that don't speak to fostering a collective experience.
Thank you for your question. There's so many pieces to what you're commenting on. One has to do with this notion of the problem of the Rainbow Nation, or the problem of the born free. The born frees. You're absolutely right. I mean, the expectation created, was that people are going to be free. In fact, this is at the heart of the problem, absolutely at the heart of the problem, that this younger generation that enters the world after apartheid has been, that is no longer relevant. I mean, all the laws of apartheid are no longer relevant. And now it's a new phase. It's a new South Africa, as we used to say. And yet there is they cannot realize this newness. They do not feel that anything is transformed. As you can see, I'm thinking about how to respond, because there's such a broad question. There's so much that I want to share with you, but perhaps what I can share with you are two things. One, we have been doing research on this question of transgenerational issues, trying to understand what's going on with the young people. And one of the most spoken about experience by young people is the experience of betrayal, that they feel betrayed. In fact, many of them say, although they didn't live under apartheid, they say that things were much better for our parents than they are for us. Now, one, of course, is to take a nuanced perspective to this. They don't mean that apartheid was better, but they mean that what I think they mean is that things are worse for us because we did not expect our government to abandon us in the way that our parents were abandoned by apartheid. They expected the government of apartheid to abandon them because this is what apartheid was about. Black people were third-class citizens in South Africa. So things were better, quote unquote, for them than they were, because for them, this was an expectation. But for us, we feel a deep sense of betrayal. So that's one. With all that comes with the betrayal, the sense of hopelessness, the sense of, so many of these young people, if you're talking about, if you move away from the colleges to the universities, to the large majority of Black people who live in squalor, they wake up every morning to a yawning void of emptiness. Many of them, whether they wake up or sleep during the day, it's almost like my life doesn't count for anything. And who am I? How does one embrace their identity in that, in that world of non-definition of what your personhood is about. And so if there is no sense of worth of oneself, how can people be expected to bestow worth on others? So there are those complications. There's a complicated picture about this story. The other thing I want to say about now white young people, I know you're not necessarily talking about them, but I think we ought to think about the dynamics on either side. Now, for white people, and for a moment, I'm going to focus on young white people at universities now. Remember that apartheid, we come from, we were brought up in geographically separated worlds. You know, black people lived in their areas, white people lived in their areas. Never in the history of South Africa have white people had an opportunity to actually live with black people as they have done in the past few years. So, for instance, even with the universities now insist that in residences, you know, for the sake of transformation, there are all these transformation drives and policies that have to be, you know, the universities have to respond to them. They have to create structures and programs to respond to the government conditions for support. You know, they've got to show that they are engaged in trying to transform their campuses. So one of the things that they require is for the residences to be mixed. White people in general, you know, if you look at white students as white people, they've never had an opportunity to live side by side with black people as equals in this way. This is new. Now, if you think about some of these white young people and the homes they come from, they still are geographically separated. It doesn't mean that, you know, they're now, in all their lives, they are exposed to blackness. They come to university and they're forced to behave in this way. Some of them engage successfully, and in fact, this is an experience they embrace. But for many, of course, I don't have the statistics, but from anecdotal evidence and from what we've witnessed in terms of what happens, the backlash that we have witnessed, many of these students are confused about what it means to be white, because the notion of whiteness means that you are superior, you are better than, and so on, and now they are forced to be equal to. And so it plays out in so many ways, and this is why I think that the racist, public racist expressions, for instance, people being called a kafir, this is why the perpetrators of this hate crime or hate acts are younger people. In my view, it's because they are struggling with their own sense of identity as white, the identity of whiteness. The consequence of that is that, you know, they are in relation with blackness. Now, on the side of black people, they are also encountering privilege. You know, directly, they are witnessing, they are living side by side privilege. They came to the university knowing that they come from low socioeconomic backgrounds. Universities are open now, they're not just for the elite. And so the encounter with privilege, direct encounter with privilege, makes them realize just how poor they are. And so it throws up a whole lot of complicated issues on campuses, you know, both on the black side and on the white side. And so while there are efforts to transform, and sometimes we celebrate, we say, oh yeah, we are transformed, there's more black people, there's, you know, and they're mixing with black and white. There are all these problems that are emerging that we're not paying attention to, because some of them are subtle, or some of them are just not, we're not just paying attention and thinking about the consequences of these problems. So the answer to the issue of a much more communal connection to the other, it remains important precisely because of these problems that I've just pointed out. It doesn't mean that we now say, oh, this is not possible. Precisely because these are the problems that are going to emerge and that are emerging. We've got to really embrace this possibility that this is possible and try to make means of driving relations so that there's a sense of care, there's a sense of solidarity, I think is a better word. There's a sense of solidarity among people of different racial groups at these universities, so that solidarity then becomes the definition of our relationships. There's solidarity among us as students of this campus or as people of this society, and once there are programs that build solidarity, there's a caring for social justice issues. That solidarity opens up that possibility. It's difficult, it's not easy, but I think that I've seen my country descending to a place where all the talk about social cohesion is just talk. And yet, at the time after the 1990s, there was really a beginning of an effort to make this possible. And not only it was visibly made possible, visible, the outcome of this possibility, of this potential, were very visible as well, shortly after 1990. But then I think that the complicated thing around our country is the issue of the problem of leadership. The problem is not that it's communal connection to one another is no longer relevant. The problem is that the leadership is the problem, and so that the quest for social justice, and it's the quest for things to change and for transformative moment in our country continues to be difficult because it's not led at the top. There isn't a clear leadership at the top in the way that we had witnessed and we had hoped right after the 1990s. And perhaps it's a problem, it's a generational problem, that there are new issues, there are new problems with every generation, that the new problems then open up new challenges, which just make it difficult for us to hold on to that vision and the possibility that that vision can sustain us. So because the problems are new, because they're so complicated, and because this new generation is bringing, all these new challenges, it's, I suppose, historians, can either give us answers or not, but it's really the disciplines are much, much challenged, and we have not engaged with questions that will open up the space for new answers. I mean, what's going on now in South Africa, for instance? Where do we turn to? To history, to sociology, to psychology, to understand. And it's not just happening in Cape Town. It's not just happening in Johannesburg. It's smaller villages. You hear about cut up bodies and women being cut up in areas where the issues are not about race, where there are no white people, there are black people, because these areas, some of them are still predominantly black. You see these problems, and so we've got to talk about what race brings about, what problems race brings about, but we also have to pay attention to what are the problems in our country, that are emerging in this era, with this current generation.
Thank you very much. Could I recommend that we go upstairs where we have a reception? We've got some food and drinks, and we can all have a chance to talk and get to know one another if we don't, and have more chance to engage with our guest. So the reception is just directly above us. If we just take the stairs up, it's right across the hall on the 3rd floor. Let's give another round of applause to Pumla Gobodo-Madikizela. Thank you for a wonderful talk, and let's go get some refreshments and continue this conversation.